I grew up as an orphan under the care of the Chen family. The senior members of the Chen household proposed that I marry into their family, selecting Lily as my bride. Additionally, any children we might have would carry the Chen surname. I had long harbored deep feelings for Lily, and considering that Mr. and Mrs. Chen had raised me as their own, I consented without hesitation. Thus, I married Lily. However, after our wedding, Lily remained childless for an extended period. My mother-in-law became enraged. She not only prohibited me from consuming alcohol or meat, but also restricted me from staying up late or engaging in video games. Despite these efforts, nothing changed, and I still failed to meet her expectations. Confused and frustrated, my mother-in-law insisted that I consume goji berries and ginseng. She even compelled me to kneel and pray to Buddha daily. What she didn't realize was that throughout our marriage, Lily had never allowed me to touch her in any intimate way. Eventually, when I was utterly exhausted and lying in a hospital bed, Lily never came to my side for the final time. Instead, it was Kenji who kindly informed me that he and Lily were preparing for their wedding and couldn't attend. It was then that I discovered Lily had another family outside our marriage, leaving me completely alone. When I regained consciousness, I found myself back at the Chen family residence. Lily's mother was still jesting, asking, "Ethan, do you truly love our Lily?" I responded, "No, in this life, I intend to follow my heart." The lingering scent of hospital disinfectant still tinged my nose, and the pain was still fresh. Standing before me was Lily's mother, my former mother-in-law, still posing her questions. After graduating, I declared that I didn't wish to marry Lily. In the living room, members of the Chen family and some of my parents' old friends were present. The woman spoke gently, with kindness and warmth, a stark contrast to the stern and demanding person I had remembered from my past life. This was because I had spent so little time with Lily. Lily had been unable to conceive for a long time, leading my mother-in-law to devise various ways to make my life difficult. She restricted my diet, forbade me from eating meat or drinking alcohol, and forced me to take traditional medicines daily. Moreover, she made me pray to deities and Buddha. The worst part wasn't these restrictions, but her constant sarcastic remarks that suffocated me. She questioned my masculinity and capabilities. Once, pushed to the brink, I nearly struck her. She then cried out in desperation, lamenting how challenging it was to raise me, an orphan. She claimed that if she hadn't taken me in, I would have perished on the streets, and that she had treated me like her own son. Entrusting her daughter to me was her way of showing great kindness. Yet, I had repaid her kindness with ingratitude and defiance. This vulnerability was my downfall. In the end, I never laid a hand on her. As I regained my composure, she urged, "Ethan, stop zoning out. If you have something to say, just say it." My mother-in-law gave me a gentle push, bringing me back to reality. I looked into her eyes, which tried to mask her urgency. If my past self had paid more attention, I would have realized that her haste to have me and Lily together was motivated by a desire to divide my inheritance. Later, her insistence on us having a child was for the same reason. At that time, I was merely a wealthy second-generation heir, having been pampered. Having recently lost my parents, I thought I had found family and comfort within the Chen household. How could I have suspected otherwise? But now, after enduring over 30 years of a loveless marriage and witnessing the true nature of Mrs. Chen, I could see everything clearly. So I stood up, smiled, and said, "Madam, it seems there's been a misunderstanding. I only see Lily as a sister, and after high school I plan to attend university." Mrs. Chen's face suddenly paled and turned green. Her question about whether I liked Lily was meant to pressure me into confirming the marriage, allowing her to access my wealth without criticism. She quickly recovered, stood up, and took my hand naturally, addressing the guests. "This young man is simply too shy. Lily, why don't you take Ethan for a walk in the garden?" Lily was seated across from me on the sofa, looking youthful and beautiful, yet somewhat distant. She wore a light beige polka dot dress, the hem falling just below her calves. The dress was light and natural, with a matching ribbon at her waist that accentuated her slender figure. Since Mr. Chen was a close friend of my parents, Lily and I could hardly be called childhood sweethearts. From a young age, I always gravitated toward her. We got along well as children, but as we matured, Lily became distant. In my past life, I didn't understand and assumed it was simply a matter of growing up and needing to be more mindful of relationships with the opposite sex. I never realized that, in reality, Lily was simply tired of me. I had become an overbearing young man with a bad temper. Yet she had to follow her parents' orders and endure me. Even though she didn't like me, she couldn't shake me off. Naturally, Lily grew frustrated. If she had simply ignored me, that would have sufficed. But instead, she married me, never allowing me any intimacy, and yet had an affair outside. I hated her, and even more so myself. Blinded by emotions, I ended up living a miserable life. I clenched my fists and slowly relaxed them. I gently pulled my hand away from Mrs. Chen's grip. Still smiling, I said, "You don't need to accompany me, Lily. You should be seeing Kenji soon, right? If you like him, you should bring him home sooner." One of the guests spoke up. "Lily has someone she likes. Then why is your mother matchmaking you?" It was only then that I looked at Lily. Her expression was even worse than Mrs. Chen's. The corners of her eyes were slightly red. I couldn't be bothered to look any longer. I greeted the people in the room and left on my own. Leaving the living room, I went straight to the front yard mailbox and began rummaging through it. Among the letters, I finally found one addressed to me. Lily's voice came from behind. I turned around, silently hiding the letter behind my back. She asked, "Why did you say that today?" I frowned and asked, "What do you mean?" She responded, "You confessed to me yesterday, and today you say you treat me like a sister. Are you playing with me? My mother treats you like her own son, and you publicly embarrassed her." I quietly looked at her, thinking of my past life. After marriage, Mrs. Chen never failed to make me lose face in front of others. If I showed even the slightest displeasure, it would invite Lily's resentment. She angrily said, "Hasn't my mother been good to you? She's your elder, so why should it matter if she says a few words?" So now I responded the same way, smiling and saying, "Your mother treats me like her own son, but even her own son can be rebellious. What's wrong with saying a few things to her?" She bit her lip and remained silent for a while before saying, "You're acting strange." I was indeed acting strange. After all, in my past life, when my parents passed away, I truly considered the Chen family my own. I had changed from my previously arrogant self. I wouldn't dare speak harshly to Mrs. Chen, and I was always careful to please Lily. I sneered, "So what are you upset about now? Aren't you the one who hated me chasing after you? Now that I say I don't like you just like you wanted, why are you upset?" After saying that, I tried to walk away, but I still wanted to open the letter in my hand. Lily spoke up again. I interrupted, "It doesn't matter." I thought to myself, none of it matters. "Lily, whether you love me or not, it's meaningless." Lily frowned and said, "Trying to say nice things doesn't work, Ethan. You're still so hard to deal with my parents gone." I had no one to rely on, so Lily's attitude toward me had changed significantly. In the past, she wouldn't dare to raise her voice, but now she openly called me difficult. Am I hard to deal with? I simply didn't follow her expectations. Her so-called nice words were just attempts to keep me under control, to lure me into proposing to her. In my past life, after we got engaged, the Chen family immediately used the excuse of needing funds for their business expansion to make me invest most of my assets to pave the way for their growth. This was when private businesses were booming everywhere, presenting opportunities to make money with my assistance. The Chen family took control of the real estate and food industries in City A, becoming the richest family in the area. Over 30 years of a false marriage, everyone envied me for marrying into a wealthy family. But they didn't know that without me, Ethan, the Chen family would never have reached such heights. I could stand at the top looking down on the foolish antics of the Chen family, letting them dance their ridiculous dance and ultimately destroy themselves. I couldn't be bothered to say more. So I smiled and said, "I'm difficult to deal with. So what? If you don't like it, deal with it. Back in the room, I hurriedly tore open the letter. I actually have an uncle. He shares the same father as my mother, but has a different mother. He currently resides in Country F. I met this uncle once when he came to our house seeking help to treat his elderly mother. My parents provided financial assistance and introduced him to a reputable hospital. Afterwards, our two families kept in touch occasionally, but in recent years, we lost contact. In my past life, I didn't know that my uncle had gone abroad to seek his fortune and had struck it rich by chance. He didn't learn about my parents' car accident and death until a year later when he discovered I had been adopted by the Chen family. He wrote to me. The letter was sent to my old home and then forwarded to the Chen family's mailbox. Mrs. Chen had always known about my uncle's letters but chose to keep them hidden and say nothing. It was only many years later that I found out my uncle had been sending me money and letters all along, but by that time, it was too late. After reading the letter, I learned that my uncle couldn't return to the country for some reason, so he chose to contact me through letters. This was his 10th letter, and the content was the same as the previous ones. He introduced his situation abroad and offered words of comfort, asking if I would be willing to come to Country F. Country F is advanced, with top-tier education and specialized programs. The letter contained 10 large foreign currency bills and a flight ticket to Country F. My nose tingled with emotion. How wonderful. I'm not an orphan. I have family. The flight was departing in 4 days from the neighboring South City. I steeled myself. Next, I needed to handle my parents' inheritance. The property would remain as is since the location was good and had potential for appreciation. I would split the money into 2 accounts. Half would be kept abroad, and the other half would remain in the bank. Also, I didn't really know my uncle, so I would ensure my safety before contacting him or his family. Fortunately, the college entrance exams had already finished. I used the excuse of going out to hang out with classmates, which was convenient for handling things at the bank. I ran into some classmates who happily said they were just looking for me. Let's go to the class reunion. The gathering was at the biggest KTV in the city. At the time, singing karaoke was still a trendy activity. When I arrived, Lily was already there. A friend joked, "Why isn't Ethan here today? Where's your husband?" Lily frowned and complained, "I'm so sick of seeing him, and I don't like Ethan. I wouldn't marry him." Laughter filled the room. Another friend asked, "Then who do you like?" "Our class president." The group joked around, pushing Lily toward Kenji. The guys around me awkwardly coughed. The colorful lights blinked, and only then did everyone notice me. I confidently walked over and said, "What a lively atmosphere." Lily instinctively leaned closer to Kenji and frowned. "Ethan, what are you trying to pull now?" Trying to pull something? I wanted nothing more than to expose these two. But nothing had happened yet. If I were to say that these two had ruined my life in my past life, who would believe me? I smiled and said, "Lily, if I'm so annoying, why did you always take my gifts? Taking gifts doesn't mean you agree. You're really shameless." Before she could respond, I clapped my hands and said, "Fine, if I'm not welcome, I'll leave." No one reacted in time. I had already pushed open the door and left. Lily followed quickly and said, "Ethan, listen to me, behind me." I heard a classmate shout, "Kenji fainted." Lily quickly abandoned me and said, "Ethan, that was just a slip of the tongue. Let me explain later." "Okay." Before she finished speaking, she was already rushing to Kenji's side. I looked coldly at her, then turned and walked away decisively. There would be no chance for an explanation. In 3 days, I would be heading to Country F. From now on, I would never think of her again, and she shouldn't think of me either. The next day, I packed my room, discarding what needed to be thrown away. Mrs. Chen came over and subtly asked which university I planned to apply to. Of course, I wouldn't tell her I was going abroad to study. I casually mentioned South City University just to brush it off. Mrs. Chen praised the university, then quickly shifted the topic to Lily's marriage again. She said, "You can get engaged first. It won't affect you and Lily going to university." Before I could even refuse, she quickly comforted me, saying, "I've already asked Lily. She and Kenji are just ordinary classmates. You're overthinking things. I was speechless. She still wouldn't let it go. I distanced myself from Mrs. Chen and said, "Madam, I truly have no interest in Lily." Mrs. Chen didn't believe me. She quickly reassured me, "Good boy, I'll make sure Lily breaks it off completely with that classmate." Unfortunately, those words were overheard by Lily. She didn't understand the situation, but quickly walked over to me. Her gaze was filled with disappointment and disgust. She angrily said, "Young master, do you need everyone to revolve around you? Kenji is weak and his family isn't well off. I've just been looking out for him a little. Why do you have to make it public and even report to my mother?" As if venting her frustration, she tugged at the bracelet on her wrist. The beads fell off, clattering to the ground and scattering everywhere, disappearing from sight. She said bitterly, "I was going to apologize to you, but now it seems unnecessary. I'm telling you clearly, there's nothing between me and Kenji. I won't distance myself from him because of you." After venting her anger, Lily kicked over the trash bin by the door. It fell to the ground, spilling out miscellaneous items. Figurines, scarves she had knitted herself, origami cranes, and little stars, all rolled out. Lily's eyes reddened in an instant. She bit her lip and said, "These were all gifts I gave you." I frowned and said, "Well, if you don't like them, then throw them away." I kicked the beads that had rolled at my feet. They were just nuisances. In 2 days, I would board a flight to Country F. The distance from a city to South City wasn't short, so I had to head to South City in advance. I had already prepared my passport for a previous overseas trip. I didn't have many belongings. The valuables and property certificates were stored in a bank safe deposit box. Mr. and Mrs. Chen were away on business in another city, so I didn't need to say goodbye to them in person. They had indeed taken care of me for many years, but it was all for the inheritance. The money my uncle sent was withheld by Mrs. Chen. It had been enough for my expenses all these years. As I was dragging my suitcase out, I ran into Lily and Kenji in the lobby. It seemed like they had just come back from somewhere. Lily noticed the luggage in my hand and asked, "Where are you going? Are you going to report to my mother about me and Kenji again?" I motioned for them to step aside and said, "Not interested. I'm just going to a classmate's house." Mrs. Chen already knew. That wasn't a lie. I did tell Mrs. Chen I would be staying at a classmate's house for a couple of days. Lily, still in a bad mood, coldly said, "Go by yourself. Don't let the driver pick you up. That's my family's driver, not yours." I didn't care. Kenji, who had been silent, suddenly spoke up in a humble tone. "Ethan, I was just kicked out by my family and have nowhere to go. Lily kindly offered to let me stay. I heard from Madame that you and Lily had some unpleasantness because of me, and I'm really sorry." Lily snorted and said, "You don't need to apologize to him." She wrapped her arm around Kenji's and said, "If it weren't for his big mouth, my mother wouldn't have bothered you." It was clear they were both in cahoots. I found it meaningless and just walked ahead. Behind me, Kenji continued in a weak tone, "Lily, don't you want to go talk to Ethan?" She replied, "I don't need to bother with him. He's an orphan with no home to return to. He'll come back sooner or later." Lily's tone was firm, cold, and disdainful. I paused for a moment, then continued walking. So they really thought I had nowhere else to go and treated me this way. It didn't matter. When we meet again, I'll make sure they experience having nowhere to go. The first day Ethan left, Lily didn't feel much. On the second day, she grew restless and asked the housekeeper, "Has Ethan not come back yet?" The housekeeper shook her head. The young woman's beautiful brows furrowed slightly as she complained, "I can't stand him. Who does he think he is? What's so special about him? He acts like he's some rich young master." After venting, she asked the housekeeper again, "Did Ethan say he went to a classmate's house?" The housekeeper shook her head again. Lily felt even more irritated, as if a heavy stone was pressing on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Passing by Ethan's room, she noticed something shiny near the large leafy plant by the door. She realized something and bent down to pick it up. It was a lone bead from the bracelet. Lily was momentarily stunned. Then, as if compelled, She squatted down and searched for other beads. A feeling of regret rose in her heart. Why did I take apart the bracelet? This was clearly the graduation gift I had planned for Ethan. I had prepared it with great care. Ethan was arrogant and overbearing, but after his parents passed away, he had mellowed out. She knew this too. But why had she acted so willfully toward him? She thought. When Ethan returned, she would sincerely apologize to him. But she waited one day, then two, then three, and still, Ethan didn't come home. Her anxiety reached its peak. She began calling Ethan's friends. Each of them responded that they hadn't seen Ethan. She didn't believe it. She went from house to house searching, but still couldn't find him. Finally, she opened the door to Ethan's room. The once cozy room was now missing all the stuffed animals she had given him, the ones she had cherished since childhood. Ethan's clothes and shoes were gone as well. The room suddenly felt so much emptier. Lily hurriedly searched the room, trying to find any traces that Ethan had ever lived there. But the only thing she found was a letter pressed under a book on the desk. It read, "I'm gone, Mr. and Mrs. Please don't worry." Just a few words. But none of it was meant for Lily. After the plane landed, I didn't immediately contact my uncle using the details he provided. Instead, I hired a detective to investigate my uncle's family situation. Nothing too detailed, just a simple inquiry to see if the family was harmonious, etc. I thought to myself, no family that's already in chaos would willingly accept a stranger relative. Thankfully, the news I received was good. My uncle owned a large farm in a certain state, had a decent local reputation, and his family members were few and got along well. I also prepared for the worst. If my uncle wasn't reliable, I could still study in Country F by myself. It wasn't a big deal. After completing the investigation and buying gifts for everyone, I finally contacted my uncle. When he found out I had arrived, he immediately came to pick me up. 3 days later, I finally arrived at my uncle's farm. My uncle was more than 10 years older than my mother. Due to his early years of gold mining, combined with the harsh sun and wind, he looked much older. He wasn't very talkative, especially with me. He just sighed and said, "When I see you, I think of your mother." Then he handed me a card and told me to spend it as I wished. He took me to ride horses around the farm and let me mess around with the big dog he kept. The dog didn't look pleased. My aunt was a slightly plump white woman. She was excellent at making desserts, but I have to say, the desserts were really sweet. Eating too many made me feel sick. However, she was incredibly enthusiastic, always trying new ways to make me treats. My uncle's daughter was already married to a Chinese-American man. Thanks to my sister and brother-in-law, I could still enjoy some Chinese food. My uncle's son was only a year older than me. When he saw that I was a little introverted and didn't talk much, he patted me on the shoulder and said, "Bro, with your height and build, just get a car, tidy up a little, and the girls will be all over you." Then he took me to all kinds of young people's parties and gatherings. With him around, I quickly blended in with the local youth. After the summer break, it was time to start university. Thanks to my uncle's connections, I went straight to my cousin's university. I chose a major in finance. Nothing special. My past experiences and my current assets were enough for me to make a career. Life in Country F was much warmer than I expected. During the holidays, I played around the farm and helped out with chores. At school, I attended classes with classmates from all over the world and worked on assignments. In my second year, after conducting sufficient research, I decided to try my hand at international trade to gain some experience. I discussed it with my uncle. He didn't reject my decision. Instead, he asked if I had enough money and whether I wanted him to introduce me to some business owners. Having a mentor would certainly help, as it would save me some time. But for a beginner like me, making mistakes wasn't a big deal. I was young, with time, money, and room for trial and error. So I teamed up with 3 other classmates to invest in a small company. We started exporting Country F's clothing and food to neighboring countries. A year later, in my 3rd year, the company made a small profit, but each classmate had their own ambitions. Some wanted to make more money and start their own businesses, while others felt the profits were unstable and decided to bail out. So, we announced the dissolution of the company. Starting the company gave me a lot of experience. If I had owned a factory and handled the products directly, I would have made even more money. I devised another plan, conducted more research, and prepared to start another business before graduation. During my free time, I used the money I earned to buy a car for my uncle. I also bought an apartment near the school for myself and lived with my cousin. In the apartment, we adopted many stray cats. Some were disabled, some were healthy. I took them all in. When the sunlight poured onto the balcony, the furry creatures would curl up into a ball and sleep at my feet. I would pet one and tease another, and it would make me think of my past life. On our first wedding anniversary, I remembered that both Lily and I liked cats. Lily had said on our wedding day that we should get a cat together, so I bought a little Siamese kitten as a surprise for her, but when I brought it back, Mr. Chen and Mrs. Chen immediately complained. They said that our priority now should be preparing Lily for pregnancy, and that the cat would affect a pregnant woman. The poor Siamese kitten didn't know what it did wrong, curling up in my arms, looking pitiful. I had no choice but to give it to a classmate who also loved cats. I gave them money and supplies and visited the kitten regularly. Now, I held a large, long-haired ginger cat, and it felt like I hadn't thought about Lily or her family for a long time. After all, I was happy now. No need to remember those bad memories. In the second semester of my third year, I started a new company. This time, I ventured into the dairy industry, from raising cows to processing dairy products. I gradually improved the entire industry chain. By the time I graduated, the production chain was fully established, allowing me to drastically reduce costs, whether it was the business in Country F or the export business. I now had the confidence to negotiate prices with partners. Once everything was stable, I proposed to return to my home country for a visit. My uncle didn't stop me. My cousin accompanied me back. As soon as we landed, someone covered my eyes. She asked, "Ethan, guess who I am?" I was speechless. It was none other than my business partner, the Spanish beauty Monica. She was the only one who had been with me since college. She asked, "Ethan, aren't you surprised?" I replied, "Wasn't the plan to negotiate for land? If you came along, who's handling it?" Her bright eyes flashed as she said, "In your heart, the company isn't as important as me." "Right," I replied. "Of course, don't try to play the pity card." My cousin, laughing from the side, said, "She's as pretty as your secretary." Then he secretly gave Monica a thumbs up, saying, "Go for it," encouraging her. Monica happily handed me the breakfast she had prepared. But just as she was about to give it to me, another tall figure appeared next to me. The person stood between us and casually handed me a lunchbox. Her hand was as soft as a young shoot, her skin as smooth as porcelain. She thoughtfully took out a wet wipe from her bag and offered to clean my hands in a sweet voice. She said, "The car is ready, boss." Anna had a sweet voice, but an icy appearance. I turned to look, and her delicate features caught my eye. She stared at me, standing in front of Monica as though she didn't even notice her. My secretary was getting more and more possessive. I sighed and got into the car. There had been many changes at home. First, I went to my parents' graves to pay my respects. When I arrived, there was a dried bouquet of white chrysanthemums by the tombstone, swaying in the wind. It was probably left by some old friends of my parents. I moved the flowers aside and placed my own bouquet. I spoke to my parents about my life abroad. I told them how my uncle had taken good care of me, how my aunt was a great cook except for the desserts, and how my sister and brother-in-law were struggling with taking care of their newborn. When it came to me, I said everything was going well. I had family to rely on, graduated as an excellent student, and met many like-minded people in business. I said, "Don't worry, I'm taking good care of myself." It started to rain. The rain was salty as it slid into my mouth. After the ceremony, we walked out of the cemetery. My cousin held an umbrella for Monica, and Anna walked beside me. Just as we passed a man and a woman, the woman was holding a bouquet of white chrysanthemums, and the man, holding an umbrella behind her, spoke in a sharp tone. He said, You could come every day and still not see Ethan. You're carrying our child. Why can't you consider my feelings?" The voice sounded familiar, yet strange. I instinctively turned to look. It was none other than Kenji and Lily. When my cousin and Monica heard my name, they looked at me. I shook my head, signaling them to ignore it. Kenji kept talking, but suddenly Lily stopped, turned around, grabbed his umbrella, and threw it aside. She said, "Can you give me a break? You're really annoying." Kenji, enraged, stomped on the umbrella he had thrown to the ground, seeing the two of them about to cause a scene in front of my parents' tomb. I hurriedly asked the cemetery staff to handle it. As for why I didn't reveal myself to Lily right away, I returned to the country not for her, but because I was interested in the current real estate market. If I came back to discuss business, I didn't want to get involved in any drama. It was rather unfortunate. When I went to visit the old house, I ran into an elder, a longtime friend of my parents and the Chen family. He quickly called Mrs. Chen to inform her that I had returned. Mrs. Chen was very excited and asked me to wait for her. She said, "You kid, why didn't you tell me you were back? I was so worried about you. Wait for me to come and pick you up." I replied, "No need, madam. I have other matters to attend to." The next second, I hung up the phone myself. I returned the phone to the elder. By the time Mrs. Chen and her daughter arrived, we had already left for a hotel in the city. We were going to attend a banquet that evening. It was a chance to meet with several developers from City A and discuss potential cooperation. The banquet was quite grand. We were used to toasting and socializing in Country F, so we felt right at home here as well. At the banquet, I had pleasant conversations with a few of the business owners. Part of this was due to my own perspective on business, and part of it was because these people had a shallow connection with my parents. I had the network, and the business talks went smoothly. Halfway through the event, there was some noise at the entrance of the hall. The host, Martin, looked displeased and asked what was happening. The staff replied, "Mr. Chen has no invitation but insists on entering." Martin looked at me. He knew I had been adopted by the Chen family. He smiled and said, "It's just a mistake. They forgot to send an invitation to Mr. Chen. Please, let him in." On the surface, I remained indifferent, but inside, I couldn't help but find it amusing. Forgot to send an invitation? It was simply because they looked down on the Chen family's wealth. Without my financial support, the Chen family's small company would struggle to survive. In fact, due to various policy changes, their company was almost on the brink of bankruptcy. In such a situation, who would still want to deal with the Chen family? I didn't stop Martin from letting them in. After all, outsiders didn't know the history between me and the Chen family. If word got out that I was being ungrateful, it wouldn't look good for me. So, outwardly, I maintained appearances. Willow's gaze immediately locked on me. She was wearing a slightly worn high-end dress. Due to the recent scuffle, it was a little wrinkled, but she didn't bother to fix it and quickly walked toward me. She said, "Ethan, you're finally back." Her eyes were filled with an eager spark, making her dull, lifeless eyes shine brightly. I didn't move. Just as Lily was about to reach me, 3 people stood in front of me. My cousin frowned and asked, "Who are you?" Monica put her hands on her hips and said, "Why is there another one?" Anna, having just taken a sip of water, pursed her lips and cleared her throat, ready to start scolding. I sighed. We are serious business people after all. Lily's eyes suddenly turned red. She asked, "Ethan, why?" I had no intention of reminiscing with her, so I said, "It's been a long time. I still have things to do. You're free to do as you wish." Behind Lily, Mrs. Chen followed closely. She, relying on her age, shamelessly squeezed through and said, "Ethan, you kid, why did you just run off without a word? Where have you been all these years?" She grabbed my hand and began wiping her tears. I expressionlessly pulled my hand away from hers and said, "Madam, the letter my uncle sent you, you received it. Why didn't you tell me? Besides, I left a note when I left." Everyone in the room was sharp-witted. After I said these 2 sentences, everyone could roughly guess what had happened. It wasn't because Mrs. Chen cared about me. It was because she cared too much about the wealth I owned. It was clear. Without saying much, Mrs. Chen immediately stopped crying. She forced a smile and said, "Ethan, don't be angry. How was I supposed to know if it was a scam? By the way, after you left, Lily looked for you for a long time. You two should catch up." She said this and forcibly pulled Lily to my side. Lily didn't say anything, just stared at me with red eyes. Her gaze made me uncomfortable. I furrowed my brow. Anna walked over, telling Lily to keep her distance from me. She said, "Please keep your distance from my husband." I was speechless. Monica snorted and said, "A guy who couldn't even win me over? You should give up already." Lily didn't look at them. She just kept staring at me and asked, "Why did you leave? Don't you know how long I searched for you?" I shook my head and said, "I don't know, don't care to know, not interested in knowing, and don't want to know." Lily choked up. She took a bracelet out of her pocket and said, "I fixed this for you. I came to find you today because I wanted to make up with you, Ethan. I promise I won't be foolish again." She spoke with such sincerity, her eyes gleaming with tears. Monica glanced at the bracelet and then covered her mouth, giving a shallow smile. "Are you still in high school? What's this, so cheap and childish?" Lily looked at me deeply, her voice filled with a pitiful tone. She said, "I'll do anything you want. Just please don't ignore me. As for gifts, I never cared about their value, nor did I care whether I liked them or not. In the past, when Lily gave me her beloved doll, I was happy for a long time. The happiness came from the fact that someone I liked had given it to me. Now, not only did I no longer like Lily, but I couldn't even bring myself to waste any feelings of dislike on her. She was too weak, putting aside the emotions that had clouded my judgment in my past life. She wasn't even worthy of being my opponent. I said, "I still appreciate your rebellious nature. Your attempts to control me, they're quite amusing." She choked up and said, "Ethan, those were just words out of anger." She hurriedly explained, "I thought—" I waved my hand and said, "It doesn't matter." I took a glass of champagne from a waiter, saying indifferently, "Does your husband know you're here to see me? Please don't waste my time with business." "Okay." Lily's lips trembled, clearly shaken by the blow. In my past life, if I had wanted to say even one more word to her, she would have. Don't disturb her. She had a lot to do. She was doing her hair, shopping, baking. But in truth, all she was doing was spending every night with Kenji, having children and living a carefree life. As I was about to leave, Lily panicked. She said, "Please don't go. Let's start over." Okay, before I could respond, my cousin spoke up first. "Is your husband running over here to seduce my cousin? Who is this woman?" Lily's face turned pale. She trembled and said, "I didn't mean to hide my marriage, Ethan. I just wanted to win you back. Please don't be angry. I was tricked by Kenji. He drugged me, and that's how I made a mistake all these years. I've kept myself for you." Wait, can we please not insult the phrase "kept myself"? What's there for me to be angry about? In the end, Mrs. Chen and her daughter were still escorted out by Martin. The banquet ended, but Lily was still waiting to see me. Unexpectedly, Kenji arrived and started punching and kicking her. He yelled at her, "You're carrying my child and you're still going to meet with another man. How cheap can you be?" Pregnant women tend to be more irritable. Lily lost her temper, yelling at him to get away. The two of them ended up fighting. In the end, Kenji, furious, landed a punch and knocked Lily down. The crimson liquid began to trail down her leg. I turned my gaze away and got into the car. Even as the blood kept flowing, Lily still screamed towards my car from a distance, continuously shouting my name. My cousin, in disbelief, said, "She really is obsessed." "What a trashy woman," I corrected him. "It's not obsession. She's trying to use our past to move me, to get me to help the Chen family. This kind of woman only loves herself." The business negotiations went quite well. I was co-investing with Martin and others to develop the largest new shopping mall in a city. Due to the preliminary preparations, I needed to stay in the country for a while. Monica headed back first. Before she left, she couldn't stop nagging me. "There's an old saying in your country, 'A good horse doesn't eat the grass it passed by. Don't make up with that guy. Also, that female secretary of yours is no good. Her voice is so soft you can tell she's a pretentious coquette. Anna quietly walked over and said, "Boss, actually, I can do a dominatrix voice too." I rolled my eyes at both of them and said, "Right now, I only want to make money. If you waste my time, I'll fire you both." Monica shot Anna a glare, huffed angrily, and got on the plane. Anna, however, silently adjusted her collar, seemingly trying to make her cleavage more obvious. I was speechless. After Lily's miscarriage, she came to find me a few times. Later, she became too preoccupied with her own issues and gave up. The Ito family felt utterly humiliated when they discovered Lily had cheated while pregnant. They gathered together and came to the city demanding an explanation from the Chen family. The Chen family's company was already struggling. After being stirred up by Kenji's relatives, they immediately declared bankruptcy. They even hired a good lawyer to help Kenji and Lily fight their divorce case. Kenji ended up with most of the Chen family's remaining assets. Mr. Chen, in despair over the bankruptcy, hanged himself at the company's old site. Mrs. Chen, devastated by the shock, became mentally unstable and wandered around, talking to the air, muttering to an imaginary son-in-law. "He's your wife. Isn't it natural to spend money on your wife? Marrying an orphan like you was a downgrade. You should at least put some effort into it." Later, she ran onto the street, throwing a tantrum, and was hit by passing vehicles, ending up paralyzed in bed. Lily begged Kenji for money to pay for her mother's treatment, but most of Kenji's money had already gone to his relatives, and he had nothing left. Moreover, Kenji had a grudge against the Chen family and refused to help. The two of them began arguing again. This time, Lily blamed all her misfortunes on Kenji, but Kenji, not tolerating her, beat her senseless. However, no one knew that Lily had brought a knife with her. In the next moment, she attacked, leading to Kenji's death. Lily was quickly arrested. Meanwhile, I kindly visited Mrs. Chen in the hospital and paid for her medical fees. Everyone praised me for my loyalty, but they didn't know I had hired the worst nurse for her. Soon, she was covered in bed sores, her entire body emitting a terrible stench. I stood beside her, smiling, and said, "Madam, you have memories from your past life, don't you? When you tormented me, did you ever think that one day you'd end up in my hands? You knew Lily was seeing someone else, but you still accused me of being incapable. When I was starving, taking medicine, and bowing my head, your family was enjoying the good life. You got to enjoy your happiness while I suffered. Now it's your turn to feel what I went through." Mrs. Chen opened her eyes wide in anger, swinging her arms. But she couldn't even touch my sleeves. She could only open her mouth, drooling. Her eyes were filled with resentment. I wasn't going to let her die. I would keep her alive, barely hanging on. Before Lily was executed, she requested to see me. I agreed. When she saw me, she cried and confessed. My mind was filled with memories that didn't belong to me. I saw how my indifference towards you in the past had caused you to live a lonely life. Can you forgive me? I love you. I never faced my true feelings because I wanted to escape my parents' control. I always listened to them, but when they told me to love you, I became angry and rebelled. How childish of me. Now I've lost everything. She sobbed. I shook my head. She actually laughed at herself and said, "It's okay. Hate me if you want. This life is so miserable for me. Maybe it's my punishment." This time, I couldn't help but laugh. I said, "Punishment? How could it be so coincidental?" The reflection in the glass showed my slightly excited expression as I said, "You think your company's downfall was just a result of the environment? You think Kenji found the banquet location by coincidence? You think it was so easy for you to miscarry? You think those poor relatives of his could easily find a top-notch legal team for him?" Lily's face slowly drained of color until it was completely pale, but her eyes were bloodshot. She asked, "Do you hate me this much?" "Why wouldn't I hate you?" I replied. "In my past life, I didn't do anything that would harm anyone. Yet I lived a life worse than death. It was because the Chen family coveted my wealth, ruining my entire life. In this life, I've only made a few small adjustments, and I'm already being merciful. Those choices were all made by the Chen family themselves." I stood up, leaving Lily with my last words. I'll let your mother know about your execution. I left the prison and knew about your execution. I left the prison and got into a car. The black sedan sped through the rain. The newly divided commercial district had already started to take shape. With tall buildings rising up, the future that belonged to me was on its way.